Before we start this, I was on the Perpetually Uneducated podcast last week, and it was pretty great. We did a journalistic deep dive on the Montreal Federal Electoral District of Papineau, and then also made fun of children with cancer. Among other things, of course.
I would fuck Justin Trudeau.
Would you fuck
I'm not even gay.
though?
I am gay, and I would fuck him.
Yeah, only if he wears blackface.
Only if he wears blackface.
It was just a very fun experience. The premise of the podcast is basically they go through Wikipedia articles and like they not necessarily riff on them. It's about learning important information about whatever Wikipedia thinks randomly is information. I think it has a lot of staying power. I'm probably going to be on again in the future. I really highly recommend that you look at it. The link is going to be in the doobly-doo. So now let's swerve from very dark comedy into actual serious professional predictions about the future. Because that is the kind of tone setting that will give me whiplash so hard it'll break my neck. Predictions about the future are always difficult, and I don't really like them. Not because they tend to be inaccurate, which they sometimes do, but it's mostly about how people handle them. There's this enduring idea that, like, people's vision of the future says a lot more about the time that that vision was put together than the actual future itself, which really is true most of the time. But the thing is, most of those predictions that you see made, especially the big flashy ones that people actually find interesting, are made by people who don't really know what they're talking about, which is, by the way, the same thing that I'm going to be doing later. They're designers and they're artists, and they're just people who think, yeah, this might happen, instead of, you know, actual, real futurology researchers with methods and stuff. Very often, they will straight up just be science fiction media, which is a pet peeve of mine, that people will take science fiction as being a prediction of the future. No! Gene Roddenberry didn't think that there was going to be Super FTL and Starfleet and teleportation in the future. He didn't think this. He created a work of speculative fiction in which these things exist, but they are not predictions about the future.
But I read this one fucking book where there's a space elevator by the year 2020, and now there's no fucking space elevator by the year 2020, and then now I think that all fucking sci-fi writers are fucking hacks.
That is not a valid argument, because predicting the future is not something that science fiction tries to even do. If you do want someone who is actually a researcher in this field, whose predictions are actually reasonably accurate most of the time, try Ray Kurzweil. Now, a lot of naysayers immediately, when they hear the name Ray Kurzweil, reflexively go, but he's not actually correct most of the time. Which is really just a mathematical trick that they employ. Because, you know, in his predictions about technologies that will emerge in the future, it happens often that he is off by a year or two. He also has a tendency of being very optimistic as to the distribution of these technologies, where he thinks, well, this is now in the market, and so most people will basically immediately upgrade, and the use of this new technology will become widespread, which isn't really what happens. But just because his prediction isn't 100% accurate doesn't mean it is 100% wrong. And this really illustrates the two camps of people that exist, in my estimation, as to predicting the future. And really, it's just one camp that gets increasingly salty the deeper you get into it. All of the things that humanity is hardwired for this, all of the things that are uncertain are scary to us. And the future is by its very nature uncertain, and therefore scary to us. So we want to make it certain. This is why you have some people who go, oh, we trust the experts, take their predictions as 100% accurate dogma, which they are not intended as in the first place, because researchers understand that that's not how these things work. And when eventually they inevitably find out that some expert that they trusted was minutely wrong about one of the predictions that they made, they will just straight up jump into the you can't ever predict anything in any way ever at all camp, switching one kind of certainty for a different kind of certainty, never actually looking for the truth. Because in reality, the situation, as it tends to be, is much more complicated. The world is a system wherein there is significant chaos, and the more chaos you have, the more difficult it is to make a precise prediction. The further your prediction is into the future, or the more precisely it is defined, both of these factors increase its susceptibility to chaos and thus its chances to be wrong. This is why they don't do a day-by-day weather report for 3 months from now, but they will tell you that as summer goes away, generally temperatures will drop. So that was a very long introduction to make some predictions of my own, because I have collected a few over the years. But unlike Ray Kurzweil and other futurologists, I will not really be focusing on the technological aspects, because there's already a lot of that happening, and also because I will be treating systems where there is even a lot more chaos, I won't feel as bad when it inevitably turns out that I was wrong. Self-care begins in the now. Or maybe it's just that there's a lot less chaos because human nature hasn't really changed all that much over time. So barring any major paradigm shifts, like a black swan events that will just completely change the rules, here are 5 thematically entirely unrelated things that I think will happen in the coming decades. Geopolitics first. The American empire will continue to crumble and fall. I'm sorry, but this is happening already, and it's going to continue to happen. Not only is this generally the way that empires go, but you can see the internal political pressure within the United States of America, so the capital of the American empire, to make the empire go away. Although neoliberals and neoconservatives dominate the political landscape in the United States, they don't actually represent what the majority of people in America think. They're just the technocrats that sit in the political establishment, which by the nature of the system is very difficult to dislodge. Most of the people on the left, the right, the center, they're not huge fans of these endless wars and constant foreign intervention that happens all of the time. And as that wanes, so will America's global influence. However, a lot of people confuse the collapse of the American empire with the collapse of the United States of America, because they historically inaccurately extrapolate from the fall of Rome, which America likes to compare itself to, as all empires have done in the Western Hemisphere for a long period of time, instead of the more obvious historical example that was more recent and played by more of the rules and paradigms of modern times. The British Empire collapsed. But the UK is still a thing. Not only is it still a thing, it's a prosperous nation and international power that still wields a lot of influence. That's what's going to happen to America, and for the American people at least, I think that's a good thing. The United States will still have significant international influence and economic strength. But as the focus of political work and statesmanship shifts from external factors to internal control, the reforms required to retain the status that will be retained will become clear. Unless you were rich, the United Kingdom during the British Empire wasn't a great place to live, frankly. And the same has been true for many empires throughout human history. But as the empire went away, the quality of life for non-aristocrats increased significantly. Those people are essential for running a modern nation state that isn't an empire. So geopolitical implications aside, I think that the decline of empire will be a good thing for the American people. Prediction number 2 is more like small scale and civil in nature, but it's still pretty harsh. It's also not too far into the future, I think. I think in about 10 years, hearing about people who are suing their parents because of medical procedures undertaken during childhood that would help them transition will be somewhat common. Don't get me wrong, I think trans acceptance is a great thing. However, I am also aware that experimenting a little bit with sex and gender and the perceptions thereof, the self-perceptions thereof, are very common stages in the development of many children and teenagers. Usually, those don't mean that they are trans. However, with the way that political and cultural perspectives on this have shifted and are still continuing to shift, a a lot of parents will just jump on that wagon the moment that their offspring does something that may well be just a phase. Which, in a way, is what you would want to happen for all of the children that do actually turn out to be trans. But it's a very complex issue. And that may well be the very positive and honorable reasoning of those parents. They would probably want their child to experience as little dysmorphia as possible, to make them as comfortable as possible, and to help them and to tell them, oh no, you're doubting this, but you shouldn't. No. You are trans. There's no reason to doubt this. Meanwhile, the child has kind of figured out that the whole trans thing, I don't know, not actually something I want to do, but the parents are now very into the idea. This happens all of the time with all of the things. If you've ever had a conversation with your parents where you talked about a hobby that they made you go to and attend regularly, that you never actually enjoyed, and they react with disbelief and go, but I thought you liked doing the thing. You know what I'm talking about. When you are young, receiving love and attention from your parents is a very high priority for you, even if you may not be aware of it. And if being trans gives you love and attention from your parents, especially if it otherwise wouldn't, which might also be a kind of situation that might happen, you might do it for the reason that you want that love and affection and not because you actually are trans, because not having developed the brain structure for that, you can't really judge the consequences and you can't really be blamed for that because you're a teenager. And the parents' intentions may not actually be all that good either. Right now, and for the longest time really, you will have parents who abuse their children and pressure them into not thinking that they are trans, into not even accepting the idea of that because they consider it socially unacceptable, as do their peers. What do you think will happen once we live in a culture where being the parents of a trans child gives you a lot of social status because you're such good people? How many parents do you think will pressure their children into this? Because hormone injections and genital surgeries in the area of sex characteristics have somewhat longer lasting effects than having to go to piano practice twice a week. And it's not like parents pretending that their children are sick to the point where the children themselves think that they are sick is something that is recent. I know you'd love to hear that just the acceptance of trans people by society at large will just be a perfect thing that could absolutely have no negative consequences whatsoever, because after all, it is a good thing. They should be accepted by society as the gender that they identify as. But that's just not how it works. Nothing ever has no negative consequences at all. Especially with things like this, it's going to ruin a few lives. It's just that the idea is to ruin as few lives as possible. Prediction number 3, different intellectual ballpark, but a little farther in the future, I'd say. In like 20 years, you're gonna hear about a simp husband murdering his feminist wife from time to time in the news. And listen, I'm not talking about the overwhelming majority of feminists here. I'm also not talking about women who have simps. I'm talking about a very particular kind of currently young woman, tends to be a radical feminist, that's just a reality of this, who is actually mostly a narcissistic, power-tripping bitch who likes to exert control and influence over her simps by abusing them. She's gonna settle down and marry one of them eventually. And that man, even though he thinks he has gotten the golden ticket, actually has the worst of the rides in the carnival of hell. It should be no surprise to anyone that living under the boot of an abusive cunt for 20 years will not really do much good to anyone's mental health. This kind of woman, which in 20 years society will have probably a term for them, like we do, like Karens, let me talk to your manager bitches right now. They will have so utterly destroyed the psyche and self-worth of these men that they will just snap. Not all of them, I think. And again, this will just in raw numbers be a very, very rare phenomenon. But when midlife crises of our generation start to roll around, you're gonna see that happening from time to time. These men will have been so utterly destroyed and feel so utterly powerless over the world around them and powerless over themselves that they will desperately try to take back any amount of power over themselves and the world, and they will do this by attacking the thing that holds most power over them, their wives. This also isn't a new phenomenon. This has happened throughout history, usually the other way around, with wives murdering their abusive husbands. But with how frequently men are demonized in this generation compared to previous generations, and with how utterly destroyed their self-worth is, a lot of them are going to be very vulnerable to emotional predators, which absolutely exist. Beyond that, in the future, however, I think we're gonna get like a more egalitarian footing, and it's gonna be like 50-50. But this is a very loose prediction beyond that. It's just something that happens from time to time, because no, I'm sorry, feminism will not solve the existence of abusive relationships. I'm not sure that anything can. Let's talk about something a little more hopeful, shall we? And frankly, something that might actually impact your life in any way, because the previous two, at most, you're going to read about it in the news. With the effects of climate change and the development of technology allowing us to do these things while also remaining properly connected to the world, I think that seasteading will become a much more common thing in urban planning and generally just people's lives. And the first places that it's going to happen is the Netherlands, Japan, and Southeast Asia. If you don't know what I'm talking about, seasteading refers to the creation of permanent human habitats in or on the water. Basically, houseboats, but like 10 levels cooler. Populations in general, but especially the populations of cities, will continue to grow. There is no doubt about this. People will also continue to grow more environmentally conscious, and the desire to protect natural landscapes will also increase, as will the efforts to actually, do that protecting, which just further compounds people being put into cities, because it turns out cities are pretty green. And we will go up with new materials, we will even go down with those same new materials. But pretty much all of the big cities in the world, because most of the big cities in the world live by water, have huge areas that are just basically free real estate if you know how to put houses there. Especially in areas where the sea is generally calm, like sounds or lagoons, we will see pontoon districts emerging as cities continue to expand. They're going to make more land, and they're going to make use of the water around it. And they're not going to do it in the same way that it's currently happening and has happened for a couple of years in the United Arab Emirates, where they're basically just doing it to flex, which I can respect. The metropolis of the future is in many ways going to be a canal city. And as we get pontoon districts, we will also eventually gradually develop a culture of pontooners, which I myself could see myself being part of eventually, because I've always liked this idea. Many of these seaside cities are threatened by the effects of rising sea levels, and really there's little that you can do that is better to provide security for themselves than having entire parts of the city for whom that isn't really a problem. More than just static pontoon districts, houseboats also will probably become a lot more common, as will the practice of taking your home with you when you move cities. We will do something that humanity has never done before on a large scale. We will actually begin to cultivate the seas and eventually the oceans. The ocean and the seas also are really the only remaining habitats that haven't been big time cultivated by humanity. Because even most of the natural spaces that you see in the world, things that people perceive as being just nature, they exist because of human habitation. Seasteading and marine agriculture will decrease some of the strain on global deforestation, maybe even increase the total available biomass in these specific areas of the sea, creating thriving new ecospheres, which will generate a lot of ecological change. That much is for sure. Not everybody's going to be a fan of that, and eventually we will also just have ocean-going floating cities that aren't just tied down to a specific part of the world, but which use the economic incentives that exist to be traveling around the globe all the time. And although this will happen with more thought than is usually given or has in the past been given to being eco-friendly, a lot of pollution will increase while some pollution also decreases. Think of it like this. People rarely want to live in areas that are full of garbage. Even the impoverished people that are forced to live in such areas because the rich people dump their garbage there are not generally fans of it. Especially in Southeast Asia, most of the areas that would be tremendous for seasteading to sort of decompress the very overstrained urban centers that exist there are full of garbage. Given that pontoon districts will be somewhat expensive to build, at least at first, they will be hip and new and cool and will probably incorporate a lot of eco-friendly new design, they will at first be inhabited primarily by affluent people. And those affluent people will also have the money to make sure that there isn't any trash around their house. This, coupled with the rising plastic reclamation industry, as it turns out that oil has become a bit too expensive to extract from the ground, will ultimately, I think, be a good thing for pollution levels in general. But again, there's going to be some people who do not like that. Which brings me to my fifth and final prediction: eco-terrorism. It's gonna happen a lot more than it does now. Even as people have gotten increasingly mad and desperate as to the coming effects of climate change, governments and big corporations have failed to actually do a lot of effective things about it. I mean, 40 years ago people were already protesting it, and some things have happened, but it's really nowhere near enough. Even in the many countries where renewable energies have become more profitable than their fossil fuel counterparts, those fossil fuel counterparts are still held up by government subsidies in order to keep them competitive. Because this is one of the big things that they don't tell you, is though there's certainly government incentives for green energy, there is a lot more of those for fossil fuels. And as these aristocratic interests continue to exploit the future, a lot of people, especially young people, will grow increasingly desperate in their measures, and they will rebel. You think skipping school on Fridays is bad? Wait until young people in like a decade or two, the late Zoomers, they realize that nothing has happened. However, all these things will destroy the future world, and these people will have to live in that future world. So they will actually take up arms to defend it. And as defending your future goes, or the future of your descendants, the more pressure, the more violent the response. And as things get worse in terms of climate change, so will the pressure. Over the coming decades, we will see a sharp increase in acts of environmental terrorism perpetrated by extremist groups in those camps against various different targets. Because they're extremist groups. And as extremist groups tend to be, they will be very different from each other and pick very different targets. Some which are all about marine life because they think marine life is the most important thing of all the things for whatever justification that they will come up with, might even attack the pontoon cities because, you know, they have a change impact that destroy the marine environment. They might attack wind turbines out on the sea, whereas other groups that care more about the land would be diametrically opposed to them. And as these things go, most people will probably see all of the environmentalist terrorist groups as one simple monolithic block, because this is what always happens. It's also never been true for any kind of extremist group. Look at Islamic terrorists. They fucking hate each other. And if the polluting interests will still be powerful, which they probably will be, otherwise the whole environmental extremism stuff is not going to happen, they will use their control over the media to paint all of the environmentalists that stand them to lose a lot of money with the same brush of the extreme insane ideologues, which also will not be anywhere near true. It's also going to be interesting because environmentalism, though it is more common on the left, doesn't necessarily have a definitive political home, especially when it comes to extremism. So you're probably going to have like communist, socialist, far left environmentalist groups go, oh, all the planet's ecosphere belongs to the working class. And then you're also going to have far right, like neo-Nazi environmentalist groups who are all going to be all about, oh, we need to protect the fatherland, motherland, nature for the future generations of white children. So whatever happens, the future is going to be a very interesting place. I make all of these predictions not as moral judgments, but as simple observations of what will happen if things run the natural course that they are most likely to run. This stuff is just going to happen, and it'll be as morally complex as everything going on today and everything that has gone on in history. Because the world is a grey place where light and shadow play with each other in the most unpredictable ways. And that's pretty much the only constant that there ever has been. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant... I mean, what's the relevant community for this? Just predictions about the future? These were very disjointed. Maybe I should have done all of these as individual videos. But this way I can piss more people off. Because there's bound to be one of them that you disagree with, and that you think that that's the one that's wrong, because you disagree with it. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, maybe buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, especially with the grimmer predictions in this whole thing, maybe try to do your best to avoid them. Although, if you do that, you might make other things come true. It's good to have some sort of insight into what might happen, but it's also important to realize that we live in the today and now, and we should always strive to do the best that is good for today, good for tomorrow, and then also good for next week. And see you around, cunts.